So it's a privilege to serve as the chair of the board of directors of Wespath, what's formerly been known as the General Board of Pensions and Health Benefits. And Barbara Borgegrain, the general secretary, sends her greetings, and she was invited to be here with Dale Jones to talk about the impact of these various plans and some things we need to think about related to pensions. She had a fall back a few weeks ago, and her foot is in a cast, and she's been told by the doctor that it would be better not to fly for about a 6-week period, and so she sends her regrets. Dale Jones is the managing director of education and church relations for Wespath. Just a reminder, Wespath oversees about $24 billion in assets and serves about 100,000 constituents. Participants, and those about 92,000 of those are U.S. Pastors and laity and surviving spouses, surviving family members, and then about 8,000 are Central Conference, Africa, the Philippines in particular. And Dale has worked with Wespath for nearly 20 years and is familiar with the ins and outs of this. It has been an excellent communicator in our annual conferences, kind of year in and year out, and so many of you know him through that role. I can't remember whether he's from Tennessee or Boston. Maybe you'll let us know, or we'll discern it in your accent or mannerisms. But welcome, Dale. Let's express our appreciation to you.
Thank you, Bishop Schnase. The most common comment that I get when I meet someone in the Chicago area where I live now is, "You're not from here originally, are you?" Thy speech betrayeth thee. So I appreciate the chance to be with you and to share a little bit about the pension-related legislation and proposals that you will find as part of the Commission's report. We realize that this is not a special session about pensions and that there are other much more pressing matters for the church to deal with here. But because the plans are what the church has determined distinctively connectional, then whatever happens as a result of our special session could have impact on those, and we're grateful for the chance to try to interpret that to you. What I'll try to do is give a little bit of background as to how we got involved in this discussion and why there are proposals related to pension and benefits that are part of the Commission's report, then spend a little bit of time on those proposals specifically, and then touch on what we might see going forward beyond 2019. If your question doesn't make it into the finals through the question and answer process that Bishop McKee articulated, know that I don't have to rush off after the meeting, and so if you don't have to either, feel free to track me down and we can talk about anything that didn't get asked that is on your mind. As the Commission began its work, we realized that anything that might cause a different structure or configuration of the church could possibly have impact on our work. And so therefore we've been really grateful for the chance to give some input to the Commission and to work with them collaboratively along the way as they considered the various sketches and plans that emerged, and as we tried to think through the possibilities of different scenarios that might arise going forward from the special session and what we would need to have in place there. A number of you yesterday indicated you had read the report, I think. So if you got all the way to the end of it, Appendix 4 is where you will find our best thinking about pension and benefits proposals. Our key priority in what we've advanced is to try to make sure that the benefits that clergy have earned, and in some cases for those that are retired, are already receiving and counting on, and for those who are still active, the benefits that they are planning to have in place when they do reach retirement, that those are secure and protected, and that the church can meet those obligations going forward. And for that to happen, we realize that the annual conferences have to be able to keep those benefits funded. So a lot of our legislation has been focused on that. In our system, as I said, we have a connectional plan, and what one conference does, or even what one church does, can have some effect on all the other conferences and all the other churches. And in our system, the annual conferences are the entities that are responsible for funding the benefits for the clergy service in their conferences. And those funds, of course, ultimately come from churches through an apportionment or a billing that's based on some kind of formula that the conference determines, or some other method of collecting those funds to keep the clergy benefit plans paid for. So it kind of makes sense that if a conference has fewer churches in the future than it has today, then its ability to fund benefits or meet other connectional obligations, for that matter, could be impacted. So that's, that thought in mind is what governs some of the things that I'll be sharing with you about. The current program has two components. Those of you who are clergy will be well aware of this. The defined benefit component that provides the lifetime income that's based on the person's years of service in the plan. And then there's this defined contribution part that's an account balance. And when you get a statement from us, that's the numbers that you see that actually show up as an account in your name. So what we're concerned about really here is the defined benefit portion of the program, the part that is an ongoing obligation to provide lifetime income. I cannot think of anything that the special session could do, even in its, heaven forbid, most misguided outcome, that would jeopardize the defined contribution part. But the ongoing obligation for lifetime benefits is the part that we've tried to focus on. The current plan has two predecessor plans. Don't know if anybody in the room is veteran enough to have benefits under the old Pre-82 program. It's an entirely lifetime income type program, a classical pension type program. And then the plan that was in place between that program and today's plan also has roughly 2/3 of its benefit in the form of a classical pension or lifetime income. What those plans amount to over time is a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars over decades that clergy, both retired and still serving, are counting on or planning for to be able to have a income in retirement. Now, the good news, these plans are, for the most part, with the possible exception of a few conferences that are still funding some old Pre-82 obligations, they are today well funded on a long-term, ongoing basis. So everything happens according to what we would hope in the marketplaces and with longevity and otherwise. There should be monies on hand to pay these benefits that are considerable and are long-lasting over a period of time. But for something that endures for this long, as you can see, things might not happen according to the way that we would hope. The market could collapse, and the plans that are fully funded today could become less fully funded or underfunded. The actuaries of the world could decide that people are living a lot longer and that these payments need to be made for a longer period of time, and that could result then in underfunding. So there's a possibility that plans that are adequately funded today might need an infusion of funds at some point in the future if things don't go well. As we have thought about that reality and then looked at the three different plans that the Commission advanced, that led us to some legislation. So I'll touch on each of these three just briefly and then look at the proposals that we've made. Now, I need to be clear that you should not take anything that I say as either an endorsement or an indictment of any of these three plans. That's not our role. That will be your role and your fellow delegates to decide what goes forward from the special session, and our role will be to make that work as well as we possibly can. So we don't have a favorite plan or any thoughts about that. Just that what we hope we have offered, it will be something that will work out for the best of everybody, regardless of what the special session does. The One Church plan, Bishop Snasey described it for you yesterday. Although it does not have a built-in legislation around church exits like some of the other proposals do. We know that some churches could leave as a result of that plan. The bishop mentioned that. And we also know that there are other exit proposals that have been submitted as legislation that could be adopted along with this. The connectional conference plan is the one where, as you heard from Bishop Muller, there could be considerable realignment of what the current church looks like. Churches and conferences moving to affiliate with others of similar belief or affinity that would result in a really different configuration than what we have today, which for us would mean that perhaps the way that liabilities for the pension benefits are currently allocated would need to be changed to match that new alignment. And then the traditional plan has the provision, as you heard from Bishop Jones, where in an annual conference might leave the connection, and that introduces an aspect for us to think about as well. So much of our focus has been on how do we keep benefits secure and how do we keep conferences adequately financially able to achieve that benefit security in the face of the possibility of clergy or churches or possibly even conferences that might decide not to be part of the connection going forward. There are three items of legislation that you'll find actually as part of the petitions in the Commission's report. The first two here, the one dealing with clergy exits and local church exits, those are, I think, petitions 16 and 17 of the One Church plan legislation. They are, however, independent of all of the other One Church plan petitions and could be adopted in connection with any other plan or could be adopted as part of the One Church plan or part of something that we haven't even seen yet, potentially. The third item, dealing with annual conference exits, is, I think, part of petition 10 in the traditional plan legislation. The first two of these, dealing with local church exits and clergy exits, are petitions that the Commission has said in its report they recommend that these be considered regardless of what plan the General Conference settles on, or even if it settles on no plan, that essentially under any condition these two petitions be approved. And we heartily affirm and endorse that urging. We believe that they will help position us to keep benefits secure and meet obligations going forward, regardless of what the other outcomes of the special session might be. Let me just explain a little bit about what each of those means. For the clergy person who leaves, under current policy, a clergy person who terminates would have a lifetime benefit that would be frozen at the rate at the time which he or she left the church, and that would then start at some time in the future. So even though the conference no longer has that clergy person, they would still have the obligation for that person's service throughout the individual's lifetime. Our recommendation is that for clergy who leave the connection, that lifetime benefit be an actuarial calculation be done on that, and that converted to a dollar amount and put into an account for that individual clergy person. That we think does two things. For one thing, for this person, especially if he or she has a number of years to go before the benefit will start, it gives them an account balance that can grow over time as opposed to a frozen benefit. The other thing, perhaps even more important that it does, is now the ongoing liability for that clergy person who is no longer a part of the conference, no longer there to help it meet its objectives, financial and evangelistically and otherwise, it will no longer have an obligation for that clergy person because there's not a lifetime benefit any longer. It has been converted to a dollar amount in that person's account. So we think that that's about as close to a win-win situation as could be developed in this type of case. Halfway makes sense? If I can get halfway on some of this stuff, it's pretty good sometimes. Now, with regard to local church exits, for the congregation that decides it no longer wants to be part of the connectional system, we recommended that it make a payment to the conference as part of its leaving that would be dedicated toward possible eventual future needs for pension funding, which it will no longer be there to help support if and when those needs arise. When I said earlier that the plans were adequately funded on a long-term basis to pay the benefits that are promised, and if nothing happens that they should be okay, but it's a long period of time and so something could happen. What there is not currently funding for, let's say the church wanted to just say, okay, let's get rid of all of these long-term obligations. We'll go contract with an insurance company to take on all of this responsibility and make all these payments for the next decades and decades and decades. The insurance company would want more money than we have in the plans to do that because it is now taking on all of this long-term significant risk over time. Well, in a sense, when a church leaves the conference, separates from its sister churches that are have been part of the connection, separates from the connectional obligations that the conference has accumulated for the clergy who have served that church and other churches. The conference is sort of becoming its insurer. Now the risk that it no longer has as separating from the connection falls back to its annual conference and all of its sister churches. So we believe it's not an unreasonable thing for that church to fund whatever its share of liability would be that would be needed to outsource those benefits if that were to ever need to be priced out. Now, this is the area, I want to say, this is the area that the Commission asked us to deal with. This is not to say that a payment for future pension needs is the only thing that a church that leaves the connection should be responsible for. And in fact, some of the other legislation that you may have seen that's been introduced by others, some of those 61 petitions or 79 petitions that somebody mentioned yesterday, call for apportionment payments of a certain period of time and other kinds of obligations. So we're not saying that, take care of the pension and then you should be done. It's just that's the part that we were asked to deal with. And in a meeting that I was in earlier in one of the conferences where the bishop has already dealt with a number of cases of churches leaving, he was really, the bishop was quite adamant that it was very important that this particular piece of legislation be adopted so that, that there is a basis for requesting something from a departing church to help meet the obligations that it is kind of leaving behind with its fellow churches. The connectional conference plan is the one that, as we mentioned earlier, could result in some churches that are aligned geographically with one group today, moving to other things, moving to another area. This plan could result in the need to do quite a bit of reallocation of assets and liabilities to align with whatever the new configuration of the church would be. The current system is not all that simple, even without other complications. Let's look at a pastor with a 42 career who retired this last summer, and they started out in Conference A, and then they moved to Conference B under the old Pre-82 plan. We didn't know to call it Pre-82 back in the 70s, obviously, but that's what we call it today. The second conference had a different Pre-82 benefit than the first one does. Then they stayed in that conference after the next plan came in for several years. Then they moved back to their first conference, but under a different formula that had a different formula than the prior conference did for the ministerial pension plan. And then they were under two different formulas under the clergy retirement security program, the one that was in place through 13 and the one that we have today. So there's quite a bit of record keeping involved already just to get this person's benefits from these various sources and various calculations. Now, let's imagine that in the connectional conference plan, most of the Conference A churches went to Connectional Conference 1, but one of them went to Connectional Conference 3. And then most of the Conference B churches went to Connectional Conference 2, but a couple of them also went to Connectional Conference 3. Now we need to take the obligations, the liabilities for this clergy person's service and realign them very differently than what they have been in the past. And so you could see this scenario happening many times over in the connectional conference plan. The good news about this, as Bishop Muller pointed out, this is not a plan that gets implemented immediately. You know, it doesn't go into effect on February 28th. There are constitutional amendments to be ratified and then an entire time frame that goes out to about, I think, 2025. So what this means is we already have the data, the information to do this reallocation, and thankfully the time frame for the plan gives us the time to do it as well. But that would be the significant work for us with the connectional conference plan. And then the traditional plan has this feature wherein an annual conference in total might leave the connection. What we would propose there is that that annual conference would fund the obligations that it has, and then it would continue to be responsible for keeping those lifetime benefits adequately funded as a separate entity with its assets and liabilities spun off from the rest of the connectional plan. This is not too dissimilar to what happened. Some of you well recall, it was in the 90s, I believe, when the Puerto Rico Annual Conference became the Methodist Church of Puerto Rico. We still, to this day, administer benefit plans for the Methodist Church of Puerto Rico. But after they ceased to be part of the United Methodist Connection and became an autonomous church, they separated their plan out. We spun it off. Their assets and liabilities moved into a separate plan, a separate program, not a part of the rest of the connectional plan. So this would be kind of a similar type situation the way we envision it. Then it is up to that new entity, that new whatever it becomes, autonomous church or association of churches, to keep its obligations funded, and its prosperity or lack thereof would not have any effect on the rest of the connectional program. The other wrinkle that could happen with that situation would be that maybe some of the clergy for that conference that has decided to go become an autonomous unit say, well, we're really better aligned with the United Methodist connection, and we would like to transfer into remaining annual conferences within the United Methodist Church, and we would recommend there that the assets and liabilities related to their service stay in the connectional pool, which would continue to have responsibility for them as United Methodist clergy, rather than be part of what gets moved out to that conference. So those are the kind of key elements of the two proposals that we hope you will consider most seriously in relation to the pension legislation. We have other information and possibilities that are spelled out in Appendix 4, but we would heartily agree with the Commission's statement that we would hope that these two petitions would be considered whatever other decisions the General Conference makes. The seeming reality, maybe it doesn't happen this way, but the seeming reality, I think, is what Bishop Schnase said yesterday, that even if nothing is approved in the way of specific plans, we can probably expect that there will be some fallout, some persons in the church and congregations in the church that may feel like that they need to go and align in a different way. And so the proposals that we've made, we hope will deal with that potential reality or possibility. Going forward, we believe that it may be important for the church to move away from the current type of benefit plan to something that is more account balance based, all defined contribution type, so that we are not continuing to add ongoing obligations to those lifetime benefits that are already there. Let's try to make sure we can meet all of those, but let's not grow those further in the face of a church that might be in the future less adequate to keep those funded, a church that may need more flexibility than comes from the current type of benefit plan. And so you will see that as that emerges probably in General Conference 2020 legislation. Our overall hope and desire is to be in a position where we can support whatever comes about as a result of the decisions of the special session, and continue to support those of you in ministry as clergy and pastors of those of you who are in ministry as laypersons in doing the work that goes forward. When my kids were small, I remember an occasion where one of them emerged from his homework with a problem that he confronted his mom with and wanted help and input from, and she was real busy at the time and said, well, go ask your dad. He's really good with that kind of thing. He'll be able to help you. He said, Mom, I don't want to know that much about it. So you can let me know. You can let me know after the meeting whether I have found the right balance between what you need to know as delegates and what you maybe don't want to know beyond that. Let me say that if for some reason a lot of your delegation was not able to be here today, and you think this would be a helpful discussion within your delegation, we'd be glad to come and support that. Also, if you can stand more information about this or just need a review, we've developed a web page that's specifically related to way forward types of questions. You can even submit a question there. Appreciate your time. This last slide is kind of really for my own purposes, but maybe it's helpful to you. Sometimes when I've been, talking and thinking about churches and clergy leaving the connection, well, it's not the most edifying thing that I can think about. And we don't use the baptismal covenant 3 anymore for baptisms because the language there is obsolete. But I've about decided that the introduction to it is as timeless and as relevant for today as ever. And I'm pretty convinced, friends, that next spring after St. Louis has come and gone, somewhere here in Tornado Alley, there's going to be a community that needs the ministry of the church. Probably the, Hurricane Florence and the typhoon that hit the Philippines is not going to be probably the last hurricane or typhoon that calls for the ministry of the church to respond to those communities. Whether it's the ongoing long-term ministry of UMCOR or it's the local ministry of the congregation in that community, meeting the needs of those people, sometime after St. Louis, there's going to be somebody who experiences a huge loss, a devastating loss in their family, and they're not going to probably care whether the church members that reach out to them are traditionalists or centrists or progressives. They're just going to need some of us to be the hands and feet of Jesus. So it's my prayer that, like Juan said earlier, that we'll not forget in all these important decisions that we have to make as we find the way forward, and that our agency will not forget that our real main purpose is the message of grace that all will continue to need from we who claim to be the church. Thank you so much, and we'll look forward to the questions.
You have lots of questions, and Dale is ready with lots of answers. So I'm going to ask those with the PowerPoint, if you could go back to Dale's slides and go back to, it's about the next to the last, or it's one of the very last slides there. It's the one that shows the FAQ. Yes, for more information there. So we have a number of questions. Some of them group well together, and in that case, I'll just read one example of it and not the different wording of different tables. Also, Dale is going to be gathering all these sheets from the different tables and taking them back to Wespath. And if there are questions that have arisen here that either he's unable to answer today or that would be added to that FAQ on the Wespath website, then you'll be able to see some responses there. Many of the questions that have been raised are probably already found at that FAQ. So are we ready to begin? Calling names didn't help. I'm going to go through a few of these that just have pretty quick answers, and maybe that'll give more time for people to find their seats. Will churches who have had part-time appointments who have paid into pre-82 have to pay unfunded liability to leave the United Methodist Church?
So our proposal is that any church, whether it has been in the past or is today part-time or full-time, would have some share of responsibility that it would need to make a payment to its conference for as it goes behind. The conference would determine what that is. So in so doing, it can account for the fact of whether that church is financially able to carry a large part of the conference's obligation or a very small part, or what that would be. But the fact that it's part-time or that or what it has contributed in the past to the programs would not would not remove it or include it in the legislation. It applies to each congregation.
There are a number of questions about how a local church's share of the conference's liability is determined.
Yeah, in fact, there are so many questions on that I didn't do a quick math check, but it seemed like, Bishop, that we got a lot more questions than we have tables in the room. But the petition says that the annual conference would determine that. And so they might, just in having talked about this with conference treasurers and others, there's a number of ways that they would do that. We can give the conference a number for what it would need if it wanted, say, to settle all of its liabilities immediately, what additional premium or cost it would have to have if it wanted to settle everything with an insurer, say. And then it would be up to the conference to determine of that number what share it would allocate to a particular church. Some conferences have said they would maybe use an apportionment type formula for determining that, because that's how they figure conference or church shares of other connectional obligations. Some have said we might base it on the pastor's salary, because that's typically how we bill out benefits, is based on compensation. So some conferences might use a combination of those or some other factors. But the key thing would be every church's situation is going to be different. Every conference is going to be different in terms of what it already has in excess funding for possible future pension needs. Some have a lot of reserves. So if the market crashed, they would be in probably good shape. Others are not so well equipped. So all of those things would, I think, go into the conference's determination of what a specific church would need. In some of the examples that I've seen conferences work through, and don't write any of this down because it could be very, very different. But if it's a really small church, it's maybe a few $1,000s. If it's a significant church, depending again on the conference and how much funds they have on hand for reserves, it could be a few $100,000. If it's a mega church and a conference with a whole lot of liability and not much to cover that, then it could be it could be even more. It will not be $500,000 for a 15-member church unless the conference knows something that I don't know about that particular congregation. So I'm not sure if that's gets at all of the questions around this, but the key thing I think is that today the annual conference is the entity that decides how it pays for clergy benefits. We don't think that should change if it is receiving funds from churches that are exiting that it will use eventually for potential benefit needs. It should still be the determiner as to, and we can work with the conference in numbers and scenarios and different ways of doing that, but ultimately we believe that it should be their decision.
The next question, if an annual conference does not have an unfunded liability currently, what are the implications does that have for the withdrawal of churches? I think, trying to interpret it a little bit, is this liability that a church needs to pay if they exit, is that just in conferences that have an unfunded liability, or is it in conferences where that is a funded liability?
Yes. Let's go back to something that I tried to explain a little bit earlier about funding on a long-term basis, wherein the church, the conference, the connectional plan keeps the assets and keeps the obligations, and also keeps the potential risk of the economy, longevity, all those kind of things that could affect eventually the cost of a pension plan. So on that basis, most every conference is fully funded. On the other hand, on the basis of what it would take to offload all of those risks to an outside source, a commercial insurer or something like that, virtually no conference is fully funded. And because the church that leaves is essentially leaving its share of responsibility, it has now gotten rid of its risk once it's no longer United Methodist, then we have approached this from the standpoint of it would be appropriate for that church to contribute toward the eventual monies that would be needed to bring the conference to that higher funding level of being able to outsource its benefits. because the conference is essentially keeping the risk. The other churches of the conference that remain are keeping the risk, keeping the obligations, keeping the assets. And this church that is left is, you could think of it as a risk premium that they're paying the conference to essentially become their insurer, take on their part of the connectional obligations that they're leaving.
How many conferences are underfunded, and whose responsibility will that be under any proposed plan?
The only current underfunding that exists is with the old pre-82 plan. And there are really only a handful, and I don't know the exact number, but it's less than 10, and it may be closer to 5, that are still raising new money for that. Some of them show up as underfunded, but they actually have plenty of funds to finish that off that are sitting in an account somewhere that they could fully fund that immediately if they chose to. So there are really very few that are still trying to raise new money to cover pre-82 obligations. And all of them, all conferences submit funding plans to our agency, not only for pre-82, but for the other ongoing obligations as well. And every conference, even those that haven't quite made it there yet for pre-82, has a plan that shows how they will have that fully funded by year-end 2021, which was the target date for that way back in 1980 when that plan was closed and the successor plan came into being.
Okay, thank you. Could the Wespath board convert all the defined benefit accounts to defined contribution accounts?
The General Conference could direct us to do that. Remember that the clergy plans for the United States are connectional in the sense that they can be amended, adopted, so forth, sunsetted just by the General Conference. So if the General Conference dictated that, then we would do that in accordance with that. We could not make that change ourselves because we don't have the authority to change the plan provisions.
Would the board support that?
There are 3 or 4 members of our board of directors here, but I don't know that I want to put them on the spot to answer that question, Don, and I sure couldn't. We would consider certainly anything that the church is inclined to want us to do. Bishop Schnase, you may want to comment on that.
Thank you.
Uh-oh.
Can the suggested legislation from Wespath be considered even if none of the plans in from the commission are adapted?
Absolutely, and as I said earlier, we would hope that would be the case, that regardless of what the General Conference approves otherwise, or if it doesn't approve anything otherwise, we would hope that they would adopt those 2 petitions specifically.
So 4 or 5 tables had some variation of this question. If a church exits the United Methodist Church and refuses to pay the pension liability, how will this liability be enforced and who will enforce it?
Our thinking is that, and I think we've had affirmation of this from bishops, conference chancellors, and others, is that it is more enforceable as a part of the discipline than it is as a concept outside the discipline. But ultimately, I believe it would be probably the trust clause provisions that would give you a leverage to enforce it. Most of the exit path petitions that I have seen also include some version of this responsibility for pension payments, and so it would seem that it would essentially be part of the deal, wherein if the church is going to leave, here are the things that it might do. The pension exit payment would be one of those things. Something you want to add to that, Bishop?
Not particularly. I have to confess, I was looking at the questions to come. But I think most bishops, when they look at this, it would be the deed of trust that would be the leverage point for enforcing payment of the liability for pensions. Which plan of the three from the commission has the highest risk to pensions?
At risk of sounding a little bit repetitive, we would say anything that does not include the two petitions that I have lifted up, we would say has a high risk, and anything that includes them has a lesser risk.
So this is related. What happens if the one church plan passes and Wespath petitions do not?
Then current plan provisions, actions of previous general conferences would just continue continue forward. So in terms of exiting clergy, it would be the rules that are in the plan today, wherein the benefit gets frozen at a current level and remains a lifetime income for that person at some point in the future. In terms of exiting churches, it would be whatever is currently in the discipline around the trust clause and anything else that got added as a result of action of the General Conference.
Okay. What happens to retired clergy, and I take this to be currently retired clergy? Can they individually opt out of a conference that leaves the connection to remain with the surviving United Methodist Church?
That's almost a question related to the legislation itself rather than the pension proposals. I believe, and I've spent more time in the last pages of those 93 than I have in the first part, but I believe in my reading, and the bishops or commission members here could correct me if this is wrong, I believe there is provision for clergy to if their conference, their church, or whatever is leaving, to transfer to remain in the connection if that's their choosing.
Okay. There were a couple of tables that had, this one calls it graceful reentry. If an annual conference leaves the church, or if a clergy person leaves the church and then seeks to return, what happens financially and with pensions?
For the clergy person returning, I believe that barring some other provision, that would be the same thing that exists today in the rules of the discipline and the rules of the benefit plans for clergy who have their conference membership returned after having terminated that at some point in the future. So they would, the benefits that they earned during their previous service would still be in place. Then when they re-entered, they would begin to earn new benefits under whatever plan is in his existence in that time. They would not have benefits for that period of time in between.
All right. So you may have already addressed this, but this emphasizes short term. How do we protect the unfunded liability for pre-82 obligations in the short term? This is has practical and moral implications for our most vulnerable population.
Yeah, our key interest in a lot of this and what's behind our proposals is because we do believe it is a practical and moral matter to meet the obligations, not only of retired clergy, but those who are counting on retirement benefits that they've already earned in the future as well. This question dealt specifically with pre-82. As I mentioned, there are thankfully very few conferences now that are still trying to get fully funded on pre-82. And all of those few that do, along with other conferences, submit funding plans to us annually. Those funding plans show the sources of income that they will use to fully fund that benefit by the target date of 2021. We're feeling fairly comfortable about where the pre-82 funding level is, and we again think that if a conference were to suffer loss of a number of churches, as long as those churches are able to contribute to that liability as they leave, then that would hopefully allow us to continue to meet the obligations to those folks with pre-82 benefits. So.
For young people considering ministry, how will the new pension benefits be different or not as they are committing to a lifelong vocation?
Our current thinking, subject to change and ultimately to the wishes of the General Conference, is that going forward, it may be time now rather than at some point farther into the future to change the benefit plan to one that looks more like the 401k world, say in private industry, so that there would be no ongoing obligations. So that would mean no assurance of lifetime income for the future, but still a retirement plan that would provide what we would hope would be adequate benefits, and would try to make sure that that's the proposal for clergy with future service. Friends, those of us who are going to ride off into the sunset one of these days, we absolutely have to be thinking about the church of the future and making sure that we are as fully caring for the clergy who will serve us in future years as those that are serving us today, so that they can focus on the needs of the world and their communities and their churches and not be concerned about their financial well-being. So I can't tell you right this minute what that will look like. It will probably look different than it does today. We hope it will still be adequate to meet the needs of the clergy of the future.
Actuarially, I didn't know that would come out as smoothly as it did. I've been sitting here practicing it in my mind.
Confess, who's the actuary?
Actuarially, what projected return on investment is used to project forward as well as liabilities? And does Wespath use conservative or aggressive philosophy in these projections?
Yes, both conservative and aggressive. The answer, first of all, I'm not the investment person or the actuary, so but let me try to answer that to the best of my knowledge. The investments for the benefit plans tend to vary based on the maturity of the plan and the level of funding. So as the plan gets better and better funded, more and more overfunded, then we're able to move it to more conservative, less volatile investments, so that if there is a market event, it has lesser impact on the assets. There's not a single answer with regard to the investment for the pension plan. It migrates over time as the funding status of the plan changes, if that's helpful.
So I've been through the stack. I did group some, and I hope we've covered most of the major concerns here. So Dale, before you step down, how do our questions compare to other venues that you've been speaking at, other jurisdictions, other conferences?
Well, there are always some new ones, but I would say the questions about the local church exit payment are quite common, and how that would be determined and how that would work. And a number of the other questions about clergy exits are also quite common.
All right. So let me refer you again to the website that's listed up on the screen. There's already a frequently asked questions page that you can go to. And also, as Dale has offered, he's going to be around after we break for other further questions. Let's express our appreciation to Dale. Thank you for being with us today, Dale.